What's going on, everybody? Here for the next part of these tutorials I'm releasing here in the next few days. Today we're going to be dealing with the original Xbox once again, but instead we're going to be dealing with the capacitors and replacing those capacitors. So a few things of note. First of all, um, I'm not going to get into the stats, I guess you could say, of the caps because there are uh, two different types of main caps that go bad on the motherboard. And then additionally, we will be dealing with the clock cap and replacing the clock cap. But again, it's hard to find a clock cap that's the exact same stats. So I'm not going to get super into that. Plus, all the stats that you need are on the side of each cap. In fact, here's a brand new one we're going to be using. Um, and as you can see, the stats are going to be, well, might not be focused, but the stats are literally right on the side of it. So I'm not going to get too much into that. Additionally, I am going to put a link in the description. So if you open up the description of this video, there's a link in there on basically a cap kit. It's going to have five of each of the main type of caps that go bad. That way, no matter which motherboard version you have, it'll have the caps you need. The only thing I would say that you need to know about that kit though is that you do need to pay attention to which cap you need. So you need to read the stat on the side of your old cap and match it to the cap from the kit, and then that way you're using the right ones. Because if you use the other ones that are included that are not meant for your motherboard, it's not going to work. Now, as far as the clock cap, which is right here, um, the clock cap that's included in those kits, the stat is slightly different. And that's kind of what I was talking about before. But the important part is that the voltage is a little bit higher than the voltage on the clock cap. And that's a good thing. That's totally fine. The main thing is, the ohms and all that need to match up, and that's the important stat. So the good thing about that kit is it's got all that figured out for you. You just want to make sure you, like I said, look at the caps you have on your motherboard you're trying to fix, and match them up with the caps from the kit, so you're putting the right caps in place. Now, in this particular video, um, we're going to be dealing with a 1.2 to 1.3 motherboard. Um, this was a good example I wanted to use for a couple reasons. A, uh, the main caps that go bad on the motherboard are right here in front of the heatsink, and that this 1.2 to 1.3 only has three of them. Whereas, just as a quick example, I've got a 1.0 sitting right here. Don't mind the dirtiness, I haven't cleaned it yet. But as you can see on this one, there are one, two, three, four, five caps that are typically busted on those. And that's the same with the 1.6, etc. So some of these you only need to replace three, some five. But again, if you get that kit, it's got enough for you regardless of what your situation is. Additionally, as I said, we're going to be dealing with the clock cap. Um, this one right here, you can see there's a lot of leakage and stuff like that and corrosion from it. Um, One thing we're not really going to cover here, but I would recommend after you replace the clock cap, all that needs to be cleaned thoroughly. The thing you need to know is that you need to do it gently and carefully, because if you're using Q-tips and rubbing alcohol and you're scraping too hard, again, some of the corrosion and stuff that can come from the clock cap can actually make it real easy for you to rip some of these small surface mount components right off of the motherboard. And if that happens, there's a good chance you're going to be screwed. So when you do clean, you want to be very careful. You want to scrub just hard enough to get all this stuff off of here, but not too hard, especially around all these components, to end up ripping some of them off. So just keep that in mind. As you can see, this one's real bad. In fact, this one's got this whole area right here is just covered in leakage from the clock cap. When I got this, it's pretty lucky this doesn't have trace damage already. So just replacing the clock cap ain't enough. You need to make sure that you clean all that off. Additionally, it can get onto the bottom of the motherboard. So this whole area right here, I would do the same thing. Just make sure you're cleaning that up as well. Okay, so uh, with all that out of the way, the next little thing you need to know is your soldering iron. I actually use a Hacko soldering station, best thing you can have. For most people, that's not going to be super practical. Um, and obviously that's because that's a little bit more expensive. And if you're only doing one or two soldering projects, then that's just not going to be practical. You do need something that gets up to at least about 700 to 750 degrees, and I believe that would put you in the range of a 50-watt soldering iron. So if you just have the soldering iron, that's just the plain iron by itself, um, then you would probably need at least a 50-watt to get the high temperatures you need to desolder these. Um, Luckily for the original Xbox, I would say uh, doing a recap is probably one of the easier video game consoles to do this on. So as far as your skill level and everything, it can be done if you don't have much skill level. If you don't have a lot of skill or experience with soldering, one thing I would recommend is flux. Now, don't mind this; has got crud in it, but some sort of paste flux. Um, that way, it's going to make it a little bit easier for the solder to melt, as well as the new solder for the new caps to stick. Um, I don't really use that on the original Xbox. A simple rosin flux core um, uh, tin solder like this right here. It's got a little flux inside of the actual solder, and that's more than enough, in my opinion, to deal with the original Xbox, because it's not quite as extra as, say, if you were trying to recap an Xbox 360 that it takes higher temperatures, a lot more flux, um, and it's just a bigger pain than the original Xbox. So if you have less experience, definitely go ahead and plan on getting you the flux. The flux is real simple. You just take a Q-tip and spread it in the areas where you're soldering and desoldering, and then it actually melts with the heat as well, and it helps to bond the solder a little bit easier. So yeah, definitely a good tip for beginners and stuff if you need something like that. So with all the goodies out of the way, we're going to get right into actually doing this repair. Now again, I'll knock my soldering iron over. We've got our caps right here. As you can see, I kind of have a little bit of a setup here. You can do this any way you want. I mean, you can simply hold the motherboard, but I would definitely suggest having something where it's going to hold the motherboard for you. You know, a third hand device is not going to really be good enough, because obviously the motherboard is a lot bigger than something helping hands or third hands is going to be able to do for you. So I have a setup like this where it's got a whole magnetic board. I have clips that can hold it in. Again, if you're not going to be doing a lot of projects, it's not going to be super practical for you to have any of this, but it's just a suggestion. Then I also have these little things right here that I can actually use to clip onto it. And I got a longer one here for the front. I usually clip this one right onto the heatsink clip. That's a good little place to grab it. That's not messing anything up. All right, everybody. So one last thing before we actually get started on the work itself. I want to make sure everybody understands what the caps look like when they're not doing okay. This is a real common misconception that these caps, when capacitors bust, that they are like busted outwards, like this I'm using with my fingers. That is not how that works at all. Your actually only indicator is the very top of the cap. Now, this is exactly why I wanted to use this example for this tutorial, because just looking at these caps quickly, might think that they're perfectly fine. Now, I have another example over here of the opposite of that. If you take a look at this, this is a 1.0 motherboard. All those caps right there in front of the heatsink, you can see clear as day that there's like an orange, yellow, reddish substance that's spewing out and caked up on the top of them. Those are caps that are clearly bad, and clearly have been damaged, and this will not power on at all at this point. Every once in a while, you might get lucky and have a console that will still power on with bad caps, but this one definitely will not. So that's a real obvious example. However, on this example that we're going to use, if you look, um, the top of the cap should be perfectly flat, and I do mean perfectly flat. If it is bulging upwards at all, then that cap is officially popped. If you have caps like this, but the motherboard still works, you could be talking about days, weeks, maybe you'd be lucky and get a month before they bust all the way, and then the console, of course, would no longer power on, and then you would absolutely have to replace them. Not only that, but if you see that before it starts spewing out the top and getting on the motherboard, absolutely replace it first, because the material in these can be corrosive, and if it sits there for too long, it can cause more damage. So if you catch it before they actually burst all the way open, that's a really good thing. And don't take that as a reason not to replace them. Take it as like, hey, I caught this early and I need to replace them now. As you can see with this cap right here, it looks fine on the top, but if I can get the right angle, you can see it's just slightly elevated upwards, and that means that cap is busted. This cap right here is even worse. This one, I mean, even me, it almost looks like this cap is fine, but if you look real close, you'll see that is slightly elevated upward as well. That's again another busted cap. Now this one right here looks totally flat. It's perfectly fine. However, if you've already got two busted caps, it's just a matter of time before this one starts to go. So it's always good if you've got a few that are gone, go ahead and replace all of them. And so that's where we're going to start today. So as you can see, I've got kind of a setup here. This helps a lot as far as just getting it held in place for me, because you're obviously going to want to, you need to solder from underneath the motherboard on this side. You need to solder on that side to loosen them up, but you also need to have access to the other side so you can actually pull the cap out as the solder is melting. So you got to kind of have it in this up and down position, ideally, to work well. Now I have a little exhaust fan here for my soldering iron that filters out the smoke, so I'm going to turn that on. Hopefully that's not going to be too loud for the video. I'll try to talk a little bit closer and louder if I need to. Now, the main thing here is, get this out of the way a little bit. For me, I'm using like a wedge tip, not like a point tip. I find that to be a little bit better for soldering some of this. Some people are going to disagree, I'm sure, with this. A lot of people like to use the more pointy tips for desoldering these. It's easier to get into them. But I like the ones that are more of a wedge tip because I can kind of set it in place. And I'll kind of show you that a little bit as we go here. Okay, guys, so now I've got my camera zoomed in a little bit better so we can see the back of the motherboard a little bit as I work. I do have a fan that I'm going to turn on. It's kind of like a filtration fan for the soldering iron, so hopefully that doesn't get too loud for the video because it's right underneath it, so we'll see. What we're going to do first is you have to take each cap and locate the two pins underneath it. So here's a cap right here. So we've got two pins right here that we're going to start with desoldering. Now, like I said, if you're kind of new, this would be the part where you slather some flux on these. But again, with the solder I use, it's got enough flux in it where I don't really need to for the original Xbox. So we're going to take our solder. And I'm just going to get a little bit of solder on the tips. And then what you want to do is you want to grab the cap on the opposite side over here. And then you're going to put a little solder on each side. You're going to want to touch the tip to the motherboard because the solder is not on the little pin, it's on and inside the motherboard hole, the through and through hole. So we're just going to get that started a little bit just to get the new solder with the flux in there a little bit. And then as I hold heat to one pin, I'm going to pry it. I'm going to pry it this way to pull it, and that's going to loosen it up. I'm going to pry it this way on the other pin, and I'm just going to keep doing that and keep switching each pin until it comes out. So now we can set that cap aside. Our next set of pins are right here below it, and we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a little bit of solder. Don't need a whole lot, just enough to get the flux in there, at least with the solder that I use. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to apply a little bit of solder to it, making sure we're getting it right at the motherboard level. And then we're going to start prying it back and forth on the opposite side. And then it'll pop right out just like that. And then our last one, and again, you may have 5 of these to do, as we talked about earlier. But on this one, we just got that one. We're just going to switch the pins back and forth as we're prying back and forth with our fingers on the other side, and boom, pops right out. Now the caps you're going to get, any new caps you get are going to have longer longer pins on them. You know, they're not going to be short, so like it's going to look like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to trim them. They don't need to be too short. You need to make sure they have enough. So I say that's probably about a good 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch where I'm cutting it right here. So you're just going to trim those off. You also don't want to leave those on there because you have to understand that if you leave those on while you're trying to stick it through, you have that much more you have to wiggle them in and get them through. So you definitely want to do that beforehand. The next thing you want to note, let me see, I'll pull another mother. Well, I ain't got one. On the front, well, I'll show you this real quick. Right here, these are where we just desoldered them. As you can see, there's a circle where that cap would be. Now, remember, we only took out 3, so you're only, the ones that are clearly ones that you have not taken out, you don't want to put them there. But again, with other motherboards, all 5 of them, so it just depends on what you got. But in that circle, you can see there's a little white part right here on one side of it. That indicates the polarity of the cap. So on the cap itself, there's different caps look different. The ones that come in this kit are like this. You can see it's a green cap, but then on one side it's got that gold line. That gold line needs to line up with that white part right here of this circle. So you see gold line, white half of the circle, those need to go on the same side. Okay, and that's how you get that lined up. So let me put this back in here. Get it clamped back in real quick. This is another quick example too with the clock cap we use, since it is a different type of cap and everything. This one's blue, and you see it's got that white line on it. That's the same thing there. So depending on what caps, it's a different look, but it's the same concept. There's an industry standard for how that works. So now I'm putting a little more solder on my soldering iron. You can't really see it because I'm zoomed in. But we're going to line up the cap on the front side of the motherboard. This part can be a little tricky. Now, if you notice the holes on the front of the motherboard, there's like solder that's kind of like, I guess, protruding outward. You do need to take the soldering iron and flatten all that out on the front. Sometimes when you pull this out, it can pull a little bit of solder out the front, and so obviously you're not going to be able to stick that pin in there if you've got a pointy line of solder coming out of it. So you'll want to check that. You've already seen the front of this motherboard. None of that happened on this case, so we're just going to get to soldering. So I'm lining up my holes. It's kind of the same process as taking them out. You just start on one side And you may need to bend the prongs, just the pins just a little bit. Oops, drop the cap. To get them to line up with the hole, which is what I'm doing right now on that side. Then I'm holding it in. I'm going to heat that soldering pad up again, and you'll feel that the cap starts to go right through it. And then once you got it through a little bit, you do it on the other side, and then I'm just working it back and forth on each pin. Now, I would not advise on the cap, the bottom of the cap should not touch the motherboard, although technically it could. The reason for that is later on down the road, if those caps ever leak on the bottom and they're touching the motherboard directly, it could cause damage. So it's always good to leave a little bit of space, you know, in between. And it's not much though, but just a tiny bit of space in between the bottom of the cap and the motherboard, so they're not touching. All right, so we're going on to the next one here. So you can see I got to clip them once again. Remember about that 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch left on them. I'm going to bend these out so they line up a little bit better. Get them lined up here on the front. Oh, I'll quit dropping them. Okay, so I got those lined up. Still got plenty of solder on my front here, so I'm just going to go ahead and start heating these again. Like I say, I can already feel them poking through, so I'm just going to work it back and forth just the same way when you take them off. And that was done. It is a good idea too to wiggle them once they've cooled a bit and the solder is set, just to wiggle it slightly. That way you make sure that it's got a good connection. If it moves at all or goes back and forth, then you need to resolder the pins because they haven't made it. You don't have enough solder on them, and it hasn't made a good connection. All right, so we're moving on to the last one of these, anyways. Get them lined up on the front again. And this one of the holes is a little bit filled up with solder, so it might take a little bit more to get it started. So that's right. Okay. There we go. And I'm just going back and forth on each pin. Additionally, too, on this underneath side, don't let the solder go too far out. If you notice it goes too far out, you need to trim the pins because you've let the pins uh, be too long, or you've just got extra solder that's kind of come outward. So you need to kind of remelt that just to get that down a little bit because you don't want this to go out so long. You have to remember at the bottom of the underneath the motherboard, there's that metal shielding. And so if these both connect and touch that metal shielding, then obviously it's going to cause you a huge issue because it's going to bridge the contact. All right, so those are done. So we're going to move on to the clock cap now. And again, it looks a little bit different on every original Xbox motherboard, but it's always this one. It's always around a big one. Sometimes there's like 3 big ones, and then there's a few small ones, but it's always that one that's alone that's kind of a medium shape, this one right here. Now, this one can be a little different depending on which version, because some of them, the pins actually don't go straight through like these did. They kind of bend like outwards and then go in, especially on the 1.6 motherboards if you're replacing a clock cap on a 1.6. So just keep that in mind on that. But essentially, it's still going to be the exact same concept. It's just you got to work it a little bit different. All right, so I'm getting this clamped in here. Okay, so our clock cap is over here now because I've got it flipped the opposite way. And we're just going to do the exact same thing. We're going to get our soldering iron, get a little bit of solder on it. We're going to find our pins for the clock cap. reheat them or heat them. Get some good solder on there, and then you're going to slowly start working them. Now, because these can be, the pins underneath on the top side can be at a little bit of an angle, working it back and forth is going to take a little bit extra compared to the other caps we just replaced. Just note that that's normal, nothing's wrong with it. Okay, so I've got it slowly coming out here. This one does not want to come out. So I got one side out. Alright, there we go. Alright, now, as you can see, this one it ended up bending the pins slightly. It's also because, you know, this one was obviously leaking, so they're not in the best shape. I also want to get some of this extra solder I got on there because I had to work it so much that some of it kind of spilled over the side. So you want to get that off so that it doesn't accidentally drip onto other parts of the motherboard later. And because it's close to components, it could accidentally bridge a contact somewhere. Let's get this last little bit off. If you have soldering wick, that can help with this too. Soldering wick is really good. It basically helps soak up the extra solder if you've got too much. So if you come across that, you could always get yourself some solder wick. It's pretty cheap. Okay. All right, so now we're going to get it lined back up. Now, as you can see, again on this one, we've got damage and stuff from the leaking clock cap, what we talked about earlier. Again, you can see it goes like all the way around here. So you should have all this cleaned up. This what I do now is I want to actually clean up this top bit a little bit because there is some solder and just crap on it from all the leakage. So I'm just taking it and I'm not only getting some of the crap off, but I'm also freshening up that solder there on the front. It's going to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to get a little bit of solder on my soldering iron. I'm just going to touch it up a little bit. Okay. Now, as I said before, because these bend slightly, this will be a little bit more funky. It's not just going to go, you know, straight line down in there. You're going to have to kind of make some adjustments as you do this one. So again, this is the replacement clock cap, and again, this is just like the one you'll get in that kit if you decide to get that kit. I have my motherboard backwards here. Hold on. Okay, so first what we're going to do is on this front side, I'm going to kind of line up my holes. That way I can like bend these prongs about where they need to go. That way I'm not trying to do that as I'm soldering. I want to clean a little solder off of that front. Now again, the clock cap works the same way. When you got that circle with that white shaded area on the circle, that's where you line up the line of the clock cap right here. So this pin goes outward towards that circle part again, just like we talked about before. up as best I can. I'll start melting that. I got one pin through. Something tells me the second pin is going to be a bit of a pain because that top side is really damaged. Oh, actually that went not too bad. Okay. Just kind of add a little more extra solder to it. Okay, so not too bad there. Not as bad as I thought it was going to be. And that's it. So now let's take this out. You see we got our regular caps there ready and replaced with our new clock cap. And yeah, so that's pretty much it, guys. Like I said, definitely check out that link in the description. It's got all the caps you're going to need. And otherwise than that, it's not too not too difficult of a thing to do, especially after you try it a couple times. And with that, that's all I've really got for this one. So anyways, guys, appreciate you checking us out. Hope this helped. And until next time.